Hi, my name is Lenore von Stein, and this is another episode of The Facts. And for those of you who've been watching The Facts, usually we're playing music in The Facts. You see all these musicians sitting here. Tonight we're going to be talking about some ideas. And we're going to be talking about education, actually, how people learn and the American education system. And with me tonight is Professor Bill Crane and Professor Alan Fagan, and both these gentlemen work at City College. And so, Bill, your specialty is psychology?
Right, and child development.
Child development. And Alan, your?
Architecture and education.
Architecture and education. Okay, so listen, how do people learn?
Well, that's a hard one, but I think basically the essence of people's learning is by applying, by doing. And I think one of the examples I use, especially with my students in architecture, because a lot of, especially college education, is reading books and then answering questions. And I say, well, how did you learn how to ride a bicycle? You didn't read a manual, you didn't read a book, you got up and you figured out your own way of doing it. And some of you figured out one way, and some of you figured out another way. And you fell down one time, or 3 times, or 5 times, and you figured out how to do it. That, to me, is what real learning is, when it's applicable.
Uh-huh.
So there's a wonderful gentleman, Paulo Freire, from Latin America. And Paulo talked about the banking concept of education. And what he did was very critical of traditional education, where he said traditional education is like banking. You take this information and you open up an account in somebody's head, your students, and you put all this information in, and then you close it. And for tests or whatever, you withdraw the deposits. And everything that comes out has to be the same way it goes in. To me, I don't think that's learning, that's just mimicking.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
To me, I agree with what Alan has said. To me, the essential ingredient is the child or the adult's enthusiasm. When they really are interested in learning something, when they want to learn, when it comes from some inner desire, that's when the learning really takes place. And that doesn't occur very often in today's educational system. As Alan said, most of the time the teachers are trying to put something in their heads, mostly things that are going to be on standardized tests, so that they can get the right answers for standardized tests. And usually what they do is they memorize material for the tests and forget it once the tests are over. But I think if people think back to the kinds of projects and activities where they really learned a lot, they would find, as Alan said, they were building things or discovering things, but they were very involved. They weren't even thinking about whether they were learning, how much they were learning, whether it was for a test. I just the other day saw a child discover 2 feathers, and he was just so excited about the feathers that he discovered, and he was comparing them and saying, this one has a gold on the tip, I think it came from this bird, and this other one came from a partridge. It looked like this, and you could see his mind at work. And that kind of enthusiasm is what makes learning really take off. And I know that that's a kind of learning that Alan stimulates in his classrooms. Alan is known as a master teacher. Somehow he gets his students, he's known around the college and has won awards for this, for his teaching, and somehow he gets his students extremely active and fosters their creativity. But I'll bet that this enthusiasm is important to you.
It's critical. Yeah, I think, in the field of education and pedagogy, there's a basic philosophy called constructivism. And the idea of constructivism is that the way you understand things is you construct your own meaning. Mm-hmm. And I think, like Bill was already giving an example of a kid that discovers something, and they want to find out about it, not somebody telling you have to learn this, you have to find out about it. And I think that's the essential part of this, constructing your meaning out of everything.
So this other kind of stuff, I've just been reading Montaigne. It's really hard going because I think it's a translation from the Old French into the Old English. But he's a really interesting guy, and he's talking about the same thing about people just trying to put things in. Don't have that kind of tutor for your kid who just tries to put things in their head like that. that's not useful. And so I'm wondering, this style of learning where it's more like control than learning.
Absolutely.
This stuff of making people, militarizing education.
Yes, yes.
And what's the goal?
Well, I think there's several goals. I think, first of all, if we look at education now, its precedent is the assembly line in industry. So in the assembly line, you have a product and you break it up into these very complete component parts where nobody ever sees the whole process. They just do one thing. In education, we do the same thing. You break it up into components. So you have, it's like the news, the 11 o'clock news. Here's a bit of this, commercial. Here's a bit of this, commercial. Here's language, break. Here's art, break. Here's math, break. And what it does is it separates these components out so nobody is really introduced to what integrated learning is about. And all the pressure is to, like Bill said, to memorize or remember things that are given to you, to spit them back again, rather than, to me, what education is creating is to help facilitate creative individuals, people that question. Well, most societies don't want people that question because they'll question what's going on and why are these disparities exist. So education is not really education. It's kind of more like a funneling or training, like might they do in the military.
Yeah, the military is an interesting metaphor, and it's as if, I mean, this idea, most of the education today is test-driven. That's how teachers are rated. That's how they may be fired. That's how superintendents and principals exist or don't exist. They get promoted based on test scores. Students often are held back on basis of the test scores. It's driving education, and underneath this is the premise that there's a right answer. And so students get what an authority says is the right answer, and they're drilled to give right answers. And so the concept, it seems like like you say, Lenore, the militarization, and Alan uses that term too. It seems like that is, it's as if we're not a freedom-loving democracy when it comes to education. It's like we're a totalitarian regime where we want to stamp each child in a certain way. They got to learn a certain standardized set of materials, and they have to learn at a certain time, else they can't go forward. And this emphasis on getting the answers that the authorities say are correct, rather than discovering for yourself what the answers are. I'm very, my mind is occupied right now. We have this farm, and watching some of the kids and how they learn on this farm. And one of the children, I mean, he wants to get close to the goats. He's very much he's a 12-year-old boy. He really wants to be close to the goats, and he finally figured out a way, which is if he goes to a tree branch and brings the tree branch down, the goats will come and they'll be next to him. And he's so excited about being next to him. But he had to go through this, figuring this thing out himself. So to me, that's what real learning is. It's not getting answers that are on a test. He's inventing, he's creating. And that's what, I thought that's what we wanted in America. We prided the individual and their inventiveness and their patents. Don't we lead the world in patents? But we're supposed to be an inventive.
Yep.
It's like Huck Finn could make a raft, you know. We're not supposed to be the robots. It's like, that's what I thought we complained about China. They just drilled people. I'm not sure they do, but some of the other countries, they just drill their kids because they want them to fit into their the pegs in the system. What's the word for it? When you're just something in the
Cog in the
system.
Yeah. Can they see this? There's
Can you see this?
There's a story that Jean Piaget, the epistemologist, did a series of tests, and one of them is that this was a standard test that was given to kids. Kids were saying, "What do you see?" And one kid failed. Why? Because you're supposed to see a hat. And this kid said, "I see a snake that swallowed a pig." And the response to that was, "Oh my goodness, what a creative answer. This is a creative thinker, and why are we marking it wrong?" So that's the kind of example. Well, you know, they're also in testing, there are pre-formulated bases for testing. And I think one example is the SAT tests that are given. And this is the basis for our children being rated and going to college or not. And there's a group called Fair Test that always does research on this, and they've been kind of taken to keep their research private, because what it shows is they have the graphs every year, and it shows that there's a perfect line in the graph where one axis is SAT scores, every 50 points, and the other axis, which has an absolute direct correlation for every SAT score, is family income. Right? So get a higher score, chances are you're from a wealthier family. And in follow-up on the SAT scores, it shows that there's a slight correlation on grades, on how well a student does in their first year, really only the first semester of college. And after that, for their next 3 years, there's no statistical correlation between accomplishments and SAT scores. But you have to take them, and there are right or wrong answers.
There's no statistical. Wow.
It does correlate.
Pretty amazing.
It correlates so highly with family income.
Family income.
That the students might as well, instead of sending in their SAT score, they might as well send in their family income, and on that basis get admitted to the better colleges. There's also it yields lower scores among people of color. People of color, and at the city university, it predicts even worse than nationwide, and yet it doesn't predict hardly at all. The correlation isn't anything a test expert would put any faith in. At where we teach, we're part of the city college is part of the city university. It predicts performance in college so poorly that they shouldn't be using it at all, and yet we put a great emphasis on it. And what it has done, it has kept people of color out because I think because of biases in the test. So it's like the society puts a great emphasis on the SAT, and everybody believes the SAT is measuring something very real, but it's not measuring anything that it's supposed to be measuring. And what it is measuring, apparently, is somebody's skin color and their income. Yeah. And on that basis, the system is maintaining the dominance of white, upper class, middle class students.
Conventional thinking.
In conventional thinking, in the university system. So it's keeping this class and racial structure of our society. The SAT is an instrument that's doing that better than anybody else could do it, and everybody believes it's a good test.
How would you measure if you wanted to? How would you measure the things that the SAT says it is measuring?
Well, do you want to?
Go ahead. You start.
Okay.
I'll add.
Yeah. If you want to predict how well they're going to do in college, look at their grades in high school. Yeah. I mean, but that's not even a great predictor. Ultimately, I think it's motivation, but I don't know what you. But there aren't too many measures for it. If a student wants to work hard, or ideally is really interested in learning, and is curious, if you could measure, that's what you want. And those kids are going to do real well if they're excited by the idea of what they're learning. But grades would be better. The SAT is a much weaker predictor, and grades actually are fairer in terms of giving disenfranchised groups a better chance. They found that out at the University of California. Right. You wanted to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think other things like this is, firstly, there's discussion, debate around the country around SATs, and in fact, there's an increasing number of colleges, especially private ones, they're just doing away with it and saying, well, some of them don't even care, and some are saying, well, we'll look at it, but it's part of a package. And in fact, there was a big meeting, this was about 1.5 years ago, where the head of admissions at Harvard put forward a position that Harvard was hopefully going to do away with SAT scores, that they weren't finding a correlation. And I think for you, it's also like a personal thing. SAT scores, if somebody's an artist, a dancer, a musician, a painter, a sculptor, something, how do you find out intelligence by a written test? And then that becomes the basis of whether you're going to be accepted and given all these opportunities.
That's a really good point. When you get into the areas like the arts, what's the relevance of the SAT?
Yeah. Doesn't make any sense to me.
It doesn't.
Oh, we could discuss, hopefully we will, in another show, arts training, which is a real mixed bag in terms of creativity.
Oh, for sure.
So all these, I teach at a technical college, College of Aeronautics, Vaughan College of Aeronautics, and I have a lot of students, many of whom don't have very good educations. But every night, I just gave a midterm and I marked a lot of the tests, and I saw with a couple of the 2 or 3 of the kids who had been really, kids, the grown-up people, really quiet in class, that they had a grasp of the subject matter that was quite different from anybody else. And I always tell them, I'm not marking spelling, I'm not marking grammar, I'm just marking your ideas. And 2 of them are really a pleasure to and well, I guess I don't have anything, but really thoughtful, and with all these kids, this incredible failure rate in the public school system, this mind-boggling. I mean, why isn't this, why aren't people, well, why aren't they screaming because people are homeless? I mean, it's them kind of, it's and all these people in jail, and I mean, I've been also putting together a program for people coming out of jail and looking at these incredible statistics. Like half of the juveniles are there for misdemeanors.
Well, too many young people going to school is pretty much like going to jail. They hate it. And they like the breaks because they finally can talk to their friends in 5-minute breaks, but otherwise, from when they go from class to class, but it's sort of like being sentenced to prison. They're told what to do. Every moment they don't have a chance to get into creative projects, to do things that are interesting to them. So it's not spontaneous learning. It's
when there are cops at the doors and they're frisked going in, and they can't get out for lunch, and
they can't get out for lunch, and they're learning because people are telling them to learn. And how are you gonna? I mean, you can get on the kid's case forever, but how is that gonna?
Can't force it.
How are you gonna? I mean, that's what people do. Hit the books, and think about your future, and think about what you have to do well. But that's not how learning begins in children, and it begins with this curiosity and this excitement. If you watch a baby and how they explore things and they're interested, and they're playing with blocks, they're playing with pans and water, they're exploring the substance they're trying to figure out. I remember our son, Tom, many years ago, was trying to grab water, and he just couldn't do it. And it fell out of his hand. It fell out of his hand. He was absorbed, engrossed in this. What is this stuff? He patted it. What is this? What is this thing you can't grab a hold of? But he was figuring this out. He was figuring this out, and he didn't care if he's failing.
He was discovering.
Yeah, discovering. The fact he couldn't grab it is what made it interesting. We consider failures as a bad thing, but that if they don't feel that pressure. Later on, if he couldn't get in the right answer, he'd probably be upset because everybody would think he's dumb or something, and wouldn't do well. And later on, and even later in high school, if you don't get enough right answers, you don't go to the colleges that you want to go to, and there's all these pressures. And
what do these rich kids know that gets them that SAT, that good mark on an SAT?
Well, that's a good question. Do you have a thought?
Well, I got a couple thoughts. I think part of it is that the SATs are culturally biased, and they're written by predominantly middle, upper class intellectuals at Harvard, and it reflects the way people see and conceive of things. I think the other thing is that kids that come from families with money get help. I mean, they have a home environment that reinforces this. There's a lot more things. They can pay tutors to help them prepare for it. They're usually going to schools where very often they have after-school programs or teachers who are getting them prepared for the SATs. And I think part of it is attitude, because a lot of people in those schools will tell the kids they're going to do well, and in the inner city schools, the kids are already being used to told that they're stupid and they're going to fail. So why do they bother?
And I don't think that even the rich kids in general, I know many of them don't like the SAT and the pressure of the SAT, and they go, why are you judging me by the SAT? They sense there's a lot more to them than that. In terms of the bias that Alan is mentioning, there is a study by Roy Friedel, who worked for the ETS, which makes the SAT, and he makes a pretty good case that white kids and wealthier kids do better on the easy items, and low-income kids and people of color do better on the difficult items. And his reason is that, as Alan suggested, is that the easy items use the colloquial language of white middle-class culture. And when you get to the more difficult items, it's a more abstract language that nobody's very familiar with, and it's more of a level playing field. So he thinks that the problem is, though, when they create the test, if those who are getting better, get the items on which the better scores come from people of color or low-income students, they don't correlate with the other items that are getting better scores. So there's it violates the standard of internal consistency. So with the test maker's standard of internal consistency, they're not trying to be racist, but if African Americans are doing better on a certain item, they throw it out because it weakens the internal consistency of the test. They don't know who's taking the test.
Wait a minute. I got lost.
Yeah.
It weakens the internal consistency. Why?
Well, when we make a test, we're supposed to have internal consistency. The items are supposed to success on the items is supposed to correlate among all people. Now, since there's more white students taking the test than African Americans, when African Americans do better on an item, it doesn't correlate with the high scores in general. So the item is thrown out, and doesn't become part of the test.
So you stay a minority with it.
Yeah. Minority. So it's highly discriminatory, but it's like a fact that nobody knows much about. That they're throwing out the items in the pre-test that the African Americans do better on, some people are trying to document this and gather the data, but it pretty clearly follows from the model of test construction. It's not that the test makers are overtly racist. No. They're just following this idea of internal consistency, and it ends up causing the test makers to discard the items.
I know I asked, but I got to ask again. I just got the 5-minute mark.
Okay.
So this internal, so these tests, the way that there's a validation of the test that comes from this idea of internal
it's called
consistency.
Test reliability.
Test reliability.
And so those items on the test that a minority of students, for whatever reason, do better on, get 86 because it's not what happens to most people.
Yeah, most people don't. Right. If a certain minority group is scoring high on a certain item, and the majority is not, the item will get thrown out because it weakens the test's internal. That item is weakening the test's internal consistency. There should be a higher correlation among all the test takers. So they're just throwing out items in which...
Sounds like a primitive science.
It made sense until we got into the real world. It made sense. I mean, I always learned in psychology, that a test should have internal consistency. And it made sense. I never questioned it in college or graduate school until somebody pointed this out in a talk.
Well, here, let's give an example. We would assume, it's an assumption in a lot of our culture that males are better in math than girls. Therefore, we'll give a test.
Wait a minute, the males are better than females.
The females, I'm sorry, than girls. Okay, boys and girls, you're right, thank you. And we give a test, and the females score higher as a group than the males. Therefore, we conclude there's something wrong with the test.
Mamma mia. Doors are opening.
Well, I'll give another example.
Especially if there were more. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I had an uncle who was a research biochemist. And most of his time, he said, was doing research, was experimenting. And that the vast majority of time was getting to find out what an answer might be. So what we do with students is we mark them wrong or say you're failing, as opposed to seeing as part of the process of learning and getting the right answer. Mm-hmm. So if we have a math problem, and we say math problem is 10 plus 10, and a student says 90, we say you're wrong. Let's suggest that maybe the student is 90% right.
I see.
The constructivist model is a radical version, and the one I adhere to is that the students should figure things out for themselves. And I think mathematicians often agree, like, if you come up with a way of estimating, it doesn't have to be a perfect answer, but estimation is part of good math, isn't that?
Absolutely.
And you don't have to have the right answer, but the idea that if kids can somehow be given tasks in which they figure things out on their own that stimulate them to do their own thinking, then they really grasp it. That's the Piaget idea. That they can't grasp it if you're just telling them answers. They have to do their own thinking, figure it out, and they do that when they're interested in the problems.
We're going to have to. We got this time. Time flies.
Mm-hmm. That was quick.
Yeah, we've got a little less than a minute to go. I don't know any way to judge this.
I got a quick anecdote.
A quick anecdote?
An anecdote on the SATs. If you look at the SATs and they give a math problem, long-term division, and they have 4 answers, and one is 0.3, and one is 3.0, and one is 0.00, and one is 0.0003. So they give 4 answers with the right numbers, but they move the decimal point around 4 different places. And the point of that is they know that kids are going to solve the problem, but maybe get confused on where the decimal point goes, so therefore they'll give 3 wrong answers to catch them.
The point is to
3
catch
wrong
them.
answers to catch
Yeah,
them.
you have 4 possible answers. 1 is right and 3 are wrong. So the numbers are exactly the same. They just move the decimal point, knowing that in the rush and the pressure, kids are going to put the decimal point, quote, in the wrong place.
I see. Thank you. Well, we are finished. Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, Alan. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to be talking to you.
Thank you.